course, it's very good to see you all here, more so. And I should, before I even begin, this may be a little bit tacky, but to our web viewers, just want to say hi, and particularly to one in Oberlin, Ohio, which would be Angelique, my daughter. So anyway, I told her I would do that. I told her it was tacky. So anyway, we wanted to talk a little bit. You have the whole thing in my subject line about foundation of our future. And just to disabuse you of any thoughts you might have, I'm not going to be talking futurifically. I'm not a futurist in the normal sense of the word. And plus, it's a very easy subject to talk about. I mean, basically, I could sit up here and talk all day about the future, and who could tell me I'm wrong? Probably there's some of you who could, but maybe Blavatsky, but she's not in the crowd today. But I do want to talk a little bit about today, which certainly from the perspective of someone who's involved with the Theosophical Society is a very important time. And actually, I don't know what everyone's particular association here is, but one thing we could all agree is that an event that occurred on this day 136 years ago in the city of New York has, in some rather strange way, been the mechanism that has brought all of us here together at this particular moment 136 years later. Whether or not we have deep beliefs and consider ourselves as theosophists, or whether we have none. The fact of the matter is that something was initiated at that time that was potent enough to carry down through the years to the extent that on a 30-degree Thursday night in the Chicago area, we find ourselves sitting here to consider something about it. Theosophical Society, which John talked about some of the founding objects of that, which are basically, there are three objects, but if you really want to boil it down, if your memory is short, remember one, that the Theosophical Society was really formed with its focus on universal brotherhood was the language of the time. But a basic translation of that might be the oneness of all life. Unity was its focus and is its focus to this day. So, just to give a little bit of background, because we're going to move to the future, we might as well start with the past. You have primary founders, which I'm going to talk about two of them, because the two primary founders were certainly Helena Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott. And we're talking about 1875. Both of them were born 1 year apart. Olcott was 1 year younger, born in 1832, Blavatsky 1831. And probably if you drilled a hole through the earth from where Olcott was born, you would reach in which he was born in Rutherford, New Jersey, which was a humble place then and still is, I understand. Not to diss New Jersey. But if you were to drill a hole straight through the earth, then you'd come to the other side of the earth, which is where Blavatsky was born, in Russia. So in 1875, actually they met in 1874, but the chances of two people from such diverse backgrounds encountering each other were slim to none, particularly where they first met. But just a little bit about Olcott, because often you hear so much said about H.P. Blavatsky, because she was an exceptional woman by any standard. And so in many ways, Olcott sometimes comes up a little bit short in the estimation of history. Why that is sometimes hard to understand, but he was certainly overshadowed in terms of the more attractive elements of clairvoyance, of far-seeing, of occult teachings, those sorts of things. But Henry Steele Olcott was an extremely accomplished man by any standard. He was an agriculturalist. He grew up and he went into agriculture, but his mind was always, he was a researcher and an investigator, which is something that made him uniquely qualified for the role that he came to play. But he was someone who, in his early life, got attracted to agriculture, and then somehow or another, with the Civil War approaching, he started to experiment with a particular type of sugar-producing cane from China. The concern throughout, the winds of war were in the air, and everybody knew that eventually this conflagration that was the Civil War would come. And so one of the concerns was, if North and South went to war, what would happen to all of the sugar production that took place in the South? How could it be replaced? But however it happened, he stumbled upon this cane, sorgo, which is still used to this day, actually. And he developed this, and he experimented with it, and he became quite the authority at a young age. When the Civil War did come, naturally he enlisted, Union soldier, and he enlisted just like everybody else. He was going to fight the good fight. But when he got in, they found that he had this knack for research. And they applied his talents to try to ferret out all of the fraud that was going on in the supply to the Union soldiers, because it was rampant, as it is anytime there's a war. But he became quite well known for what he did in terms of identifying and tracking and ferreting out the fraud that was going on. In fact, they said that what he did during the course of the war was the equivalent of winning a major battle in terms of its usefulness to the Union. So that was something that he did. After the Civil War, when President Lincoln was assassinated, the first person that was called by then Secretary of State, William Stanton, the call went out to New York to call Olcott to come to Washington immediately and bring his detectives to try and find out who and what was involved in this conspiracy to kill President Lincoln. I mean, this is the man that went on to become the co-founder of the Theosophical Society. And in fact, in Washington, it was him and his detective that made the very first arrests of John Wilkes Booth's co-conspirators. So this was the sort of frame of mind that he had. Coming out of the Army and back into private life, he became a lawyer. And still he was an investigator. And so at this particular time, so we're talking the 1870s, it was a very, very interesting time, spiritually, in the United States, as in no other country in the world at that time, because there was a movement that had taken root and was moving through the country just like wildfire, of spiritualism, which we'll talk a little bit about, because it's a fascinating thing that has not been duplicated, certainly in our times, since. So anyway, this is the American who was instrumental in the founding of the Theosophical Society. The Russian woman, H.P. Blavatsky. Probably most of you have heard more than I need to tell you about her. But from her very birth, she was one of these people who was noted to be just extremely clairvoyant. And constantly, anyone who came in her atmosphere, there was always something going on around her. She was seeing things, she was talking to things that nobody else saw. She was predicting future events that then happened, even as a child. And I can guarantee it's not somebody I would have wanted to be the parent of. I was very fortunate in having a daughter who was easy to deal with. Someone who's seeing things, someone who's sleepwalking at night and going and talking with people that nobody else sees, who's predicting the deaths of people who then die, would have been a little bit disturbing. In fact, there's a story that at her birth, there was a cholera epidemic. And so they were afraid that the baby was going to die, as so many did. So they said, well, you know, in the traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church, we need to at least have her baptized so her soul will not be damned to hell. So they hurried up and did a baptism. And, you know, they say that the story was sort of emblematic of what her life would later become, because they say the poor priest was there, and he's doing the baptism, and then, just for no reason, the candles that were involved in the ceremony fell. And apparently he must have been unaware of it. So he went on with the ceremony, and meanwhile his robes catch fire. The people next to him catch fire. Yeah, and the baby's there and probably not even crying about any of this. So after that they said, well, we got to watch this child. She's going to have a very different sort of life, which she did. Because one of the things that really marked her at a very early age, it was very clear that her interests were in things, you could say, supernatural, beyond the natural order. I should say Alcott was as well. That's one thing that many people don't recognize. They think of him as the clear-headed, investigative American, you know, the Yankee with the can-do attitude. But he was really, from a very early age, he was marked by this interest in the supernatural. At age 12, in this area where he was growing up. Nowadays, when we think about the latest sort of spiritual movement, you know, the newest thing, the latest and greatest in spirituality or in New Age consciousness, people tend to think California. You know, that seems to be where it comes from. I believe tofu even came from California. But California is where people tend to point their thoughts. This is where everything that's new and flashy arises. In the 1800s, actually from the 1700s through the 1800s, there was one particular district in which all of this very active spirituality manifested itself in the United States. And it was an area that came to be known as the Burned Over District. It was in upstate New York, between Albany and Buffalo, this little 300-mile stretch. And absolutely everything came out of this district. They called it the Burned Over District because it was an area that was just, they say, the fires of spirit had passed through that land so much that it just burned all over the land. So it was the Burned Over District. So you have such things as the Shakers, which they actually came from England. There they called them the Shaking Quakers, because they would have visions, and they would speak in tongues, and they would roll, and they would go into trance, and they would prophesy. So that wasn't something that was really so welcome in England in the 1700s. And so they came to this new land, where they found that they were equally unwelcome for the same sort of behavior. But that didn't deter them. And the woman who was really the head of it, she was Anne Lee in England. And she became known as Mother Anne. And she was viewed really as some sort of incarnation of the Messiah. And when they came here to the US, they built a community in this burned over district. And it started off very difficult, but eventually it flourished. And eventually it was something that became a model for some sort of utopian communities, and it attracted people from all over, mainly because of the power of their prophecy. This was former Indian land that they inhabited. After the Revolutionary War, the Iroquois nation, which had sided with the British, basically were moved off of their land. They just got bumped early because everyone else got bumped too, who was Indian in this country. But this was the area that became inhabited by them. And they spoke, in the 1700s, Anne Lee and her followers spoke about a time that would come when spirits would make themselves known and speak in every village and in every hamlet. This was their prophecy. So, and was one that was to become true. So anyway, Alcott was deeply involved. This whole movement of spiritualism that was active then all came out of this burned out district. People are familiar with the Mormon religion, which is one of the world's, it's one of the faster growing religions in the world. But it came into being in the 1840s out of the same burned over district. When Joseph Smith had visions, which prior to developing the whole cosmology for Mormonism, he was a clairvoyant. And a clairvoyant who focused on stones. He had what he called seer stones, and they called him a stone peeper. And they'd call him in to find lost objects and to interpret maladies and things like that. But he was the one who says he found these golden tablets that described the whole cosmology that came to become known as Mormonism and the Book of Mormon, burned over district. But then the thing that led up to this explosion of spiritualism were two sisters, the Fox sisters, who were 11 and 14 years old. And this is when all of a sudden they started to get these messages from spirits on the other side. And it expressed itself in very, very strange sorts of ways, where they would ask questions and they'd get raps, and it developed into sort of a Morse code. They could spell out the words to the question that they would ask. And they started to do it more and more, and they started to demonstrate it. And then as they started to get into it more things started to happen, where no longer was it just raps that were occurring, but now around them, objects were moving into the air. Or they would talk about spirits that were communicating through them, and they would materialize in ways that, normal sorts of people, such as us, I assume most of you are normal, were seeing these things. And it got to the point where it was something that was the rage of the time. It was in newspapers all across the country. People were gathering to come and see the Fox sisters and these amazing things that were happening. Sometimes it's difficult for us, with our often limited view of history, to come to grips with the meaning and the import of things in other times. But, this is a young nation. Basically, at that time, the U.S. wasn't even 100 years old. And this whole idea of democracy, this whole idea of freedom from the commands and the constrictions of religious hierarchy was something that was building into the fabric of this country. And so here, one of the phenomena of these kids suddenly having these sorts of spiritual visions was the idea that if 11 and 14-year-old girls could experience this without the intervention of priests or other sorts of figures, then really it seemed as if the spirit world was open to everyone. And so it really took hold in a very dynamic sort of way. So Blavatsky was a world traveler. And she's someone who traveled to many, many countries throughout Asia, in the Americas, Egypt, and always in search of a deeper knowledge, of a deeper awareness, of mystical practices, of mystical truth. And she had this other element that really set her apart in many ways, which was her insistence on the fact of what she spoke of as the masters of the wisdom, the brothers, those enlightened beings who were guides and helpers to humanity, who had some sort of plan for this particular time. And in some way, she was a part of trying to bring that about. So this is what she embarked to the US. And she said when she came to the United States, she felt, the way she described was, she felt like a Mohammedan, which is to say a Muslim, who was on her way to Mecca because of this spiritualism and this explosion of activity, of appearances from some sort of vaguely described inner world. And as I said, there are a couple of things that I think made spiritualism so popular at that time. One of them was certainly that there were these undeniable phenomena that were going on. I mean, very hard-headed investigators were going in here and coming away saying, I just can't explain it. You know, obviously there were a lot of charlatans who came on and, you know, were having people pop up out of the floor or, you know, appear from behind curtains, and all that was going on, of course. But there were others that were undeniable, where things levitated, where out of thin air things would appear, where these materializations would take place, healings, clairvoyance, all sorts of things. So that's one thing that was so attractive. Another thing, in the 1800s, the middle 1800s, 1/2 of every person that died, statistically, was, and this is 1853, statistically, was under the age of 5. So you had households across the United States with children that had been taken from them suddenly, before they could be nurtured, before they could bond with their parents. And you had this population of parents who had been left behind, wanting some sort of sign, some sort of communication with their loved ones. Add to that the Civil War, where more than 500,000, in a nation that wasn't even 35 million total. You're like, you take this room and take 2 away. That's how many people had just disappeared. And so there was this longing for this type of communication that spiritualism seemed to speak to. So all of these things kind of combined to make it this raging movement. And this is the basis that the Blavatsky and Alcott met. 1874, Alcott was doing a series of articles about this other fantastic sort of center of spiritualist activity in Vermont, the Eddy Farm. Blavatsky had read his articles and came specifically to meet him, was told to go meet him. And out of that, you know, they joined together. And then it went on to become, you know, the founding of the Theosophical Society took place a year later, November 17th. So this movement that came to be known as Theosophy was one that would go on to color the spiritual landscape of America and really the world, really up to our time. Because what it presented that spiritualism lacked was a clear view of these inner worlds and their functioning, a description of the powers that are latent within each and every human being that make it possible to experience these inner worlds, and also a clear explanation of what was going on with this spiritualist phenomena and what was not. So all of these things compounded in that way. Within a couple of years after its founding, the Theosophical Society moved its headquarters from New York to India. And again, found itself in a very different cultural setting, and continued to put forward these ideas about the true powers latent within, but again, in a different setting. Because from the democratic and open sort of young nation that was America, they found themselves in a very, very old nation, which was India, filled with ancient traditions, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, it was a nation that was under the sway of a colonial power. Britain ruled India. And so they found themselves in a very different setting. Colonialism, by its nature, imposes a view of a superiority, minimally of nations, but also it's a sort of inherent superiority, racism, denial of the value of the cultural and religious norms of that nation is where they found themselves. And at the same time that they were there, they found that the religions that were being denied, the religions that were being demeaned, were the ones that actually had very rich traditions and spoke very deeply to human need over thousands of years. So they found themselves actually championing these religions, much to the consternation of the church officials and of the colonial officials in these various lands. And really, when they got there, they didn't even make an attempt. You know, you would think that if you come to a new country, you'd want to figure out who it is that's running the show, and then maybe hang out with them. That would be the normal way of thinking. Their approach was to completely divorce themselves from the British Raj and work specifically with the people of India in restoring a sense of the value of their own customs and religion. And so there was this work of spiritual inclusion. And then when Olcott found himself in Sri Lanka, which at that time was Ceylon, his work was such that in a country where education, it was a Buddhist country, but there was the Buddhist education system had been completely worn away by the prevailing missionary culture. So this was the environment that they found themselves in. This whole aspect of inclusion and movement from a materialistic view to a view that was more consciousness-centered was the outward work of the Theosophical Society at that time. In fact, one of the things that John had mentioned that this past summer we had the opportunity to host the Dalai Lama here in Chicago. One of the things that was so attractive to him, one of the reasons why he agreed and wanted to do that, was basically because of this work of being inclusive toward the world's religions, which he encountered when he first left Tibet and visited our international headquarters. So that's something that was very moving to him. But inwardly, what this Theosophical Society has been involved in is something that is perhaps more dynamic than that. Because really what it has provided for the world today is it has seeded our consciousness with teachings which you could say are capable of bringing about a genuine transformation. The other day we had a we had a class that was going on here, and the word transformation came up, and I found myself asking, how many people believe that knowledge transforms? And everybody put up a hand. And I think that conventionally speaking, that's the way we tend to think of it. But really, I really don't think that that's correct. I think probably when we speak about transformation, we tend to think in terms of something that's really very small. Like if I come in contact with a new body of knowledge or a new fact, and I steep myself in that so that when I wake up in the morning, I can think about it in a different way, I have been transformed. Is the normal way we tend to look at transformation. Or we take this view that if we take enough little gradual steps, that eventually, if we climb high enough when we get to here, then we can say we've been transformed. Let me ask, has anybody, when you were a kid perhaps, have you ever found a cocoon and opened it? I mean, we're not going to accuse anybody of cruelty, so you can be your real selves right now, even though it is on camera. Has anybody ever done that? Well, don't raise your hand. Don't raise your hand. I did, all right? I'll take the blame. I'll be the scapegoat for all of you. And I'll describe to you what you see when you open one of these cocoons. It depends a little bit on what stage of its growth you open it. But basically what happens is you have a caterpillar, which is a worm, in essence, with legs. And it spins its cocoon. And, at a certain time, it comes out as a butterfly. And I wondered, how does that happen? And so I wanted to open this cocoon. And of course, I had my expectations of what I'd see. That when I would open it, I'd see a worm with little wings coming out, or else I'd see a worm that's wings got big. And then it's as if there's some sort of bodybuilding class going on in there, and it gets, eventually it gets kind of svelte, and then it just pops out and flies. This was what I thought, because, this was my concept of transformation. It was transforming. But when you open one of those up, for those of you that don't know it, what you find inside is really nothing you can distinguish. At a certain point, if you were to open up a cocoon, what you would find is just some sort of formless goo. There's not a worm with legs. There's nothing to express wings. Somehow or another, this process is such that it goes in one form, somehow dissolves and then reforms into something that bears no resemblance whatsoever to the caterpillar that went in. That is transformation. The electron, quantum physics has demonstrated that you have electrons that go in orbits around the nucleus of an atom. And that at a certain point, when the electrons shift from one orbit to another, in the conventional way that we might think of transformation, it'd be something where if it's spinning like this, gradually it would get to that point, but there's no gradualism about it. It's something that doesn't fit with our normal sort of intuitions of the way life works, but an electron moves from one orbit to another without passing through the space in between. Tell me that makes sense. That is transformation. Human example, a prince in ancient India went and sat under a bo tree. His name was Siddhartha. And he sat, and he sat, and he starved, and he almost died, and he was brought back to life, and he sat some more. And he became the Buddha. And the people he had hung out with prior, when he moved from the one stage to the other, couldn't recognize him. They were blinded by the light, the way the legend tells it, and had to ask him who he was. These are people who had meditated and practiced with him in the forests for a long, long time. Who are you? What are you? And his only response to them, I'm awake. I'm no longer sleeping like you. I'm Buddha. That's transformation. So when I speak about seeding the consciousness of humanity, what theosophy, this wisdom that is like that of the gods, by being presented at the time that it was, has placed its seeds into our minds. Should say one other thing about transformation while I'm beating this dead horse. It's something that probably all of us in our better moments say, you know, this is really what I want. You know, I like what Buddha's got going. You know, he got to talk to a bunch of people. And when he says something, they listen to him. You know, I want to transform. You know, I want to be like that. And, you know, we kind of kid ourselves because, you know, we forget about the process that led to that. And when you think about the people that historically you may have known of that have had this sort of experience, none of them tell you they want to go back and do it again. So a guy like St. Paul, probably most of us know that story, you know, Christian sort of background. He started as Saul, and he was in the hunt for the Christians. His whole role was to persecute and bring them down until he had this experience while walking on the road to Damascus, where a light appeared, spoke to him. You know, the light said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And he went stone blind. Blinded him. 3 days, he couldn't see a thing. Only when he was, you know, I probably was Marilyn Johnson in another lifetime because it was laying on of hands and his sight was restored. That was his transformative experience. Muhammad, when the archangel Gabriel brought him the scrolls and told him to recite, and he resisted it. First of all, he didn't know how to read. But then he told him, recite anyway, and he started to recite. He thought he had gone crazy and determined he was going to kill himself rather than be possessed by the jinns, these sort of evil elementals. That was his transformative experience. Krishnamurti, he wrote in his diaries about the process, which probably describes something of the nature of a sort of Kundalini experience, but it's something where his experience caused him such physical pain, but he came out the other side, the guy that we call Krishnamurti, or K, as they talk about it. And, you know, Native American, black elk. He had several visions, but his great vision occurred when he was almost strucken down dead. He was mortally ill and expected to die, and that's when he was able to have his. This is the milieu that surrounds transformation. And so I find myself thinking that most of us are of that mind where heaven is where we might like to be, but if it means dying, I'll stick around. Everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. So transformation is something of another order. But I should say, too, that probably, if we speak truthfully, the reason why there is this sense that this is something that we desire, something that we feel we're moving toward, is because, in fact, we are moving toward that, if any of these teachings are correct. It's something that is to be the individual experience, and more importantly than that, it's something that's to be the experience of all of humanity. The mind to embrace the universe becoming expressed. One of the things when we think in terms of ageless wisdom, wisdom is something that has no age. It has no form. But it is something that in every age, in every time, in every place, it finds its ways of expressing through the forms that are presented to it. And in every time there are forms that are presented. You take the example of sunlight. There's a Sufi writer whose name I forget, but it has al something in it. I've forgotten what it was. But he wrote about sunlight. So you imagine that the sunlight is everywhere outside of this room. And the sunlight, he says, finds its way and is seen through every window, through every door, through every chimney. And each experiences this light according to its capacity, which is to say according to its shape, according to what it will allow for. We find ourselves in this room, we could have a beautiful window, you could have a pinhole drilled in the wall, and the light will find its way in. That's the nature of wisdom. It surrounds us, it penetrates us at every moment, yet we're blind. So, to foster that experience and to find out how that might be experienced is what we do individually. Probably, when we look at the opportunities, when we look at the forms that our present time provides for wisdom, what might they be? If we look at the trends that are in our world today, Blavatsky's time, you could point to spiritualism. You could say that this was an upwelling of something really unique, something that could be utilized for the expression of a deeper truth. And that's what happened. That was the formation of the Theosophical Society. That's all well and good for 1875. I didn't live then. I don't live there now. I'm trying to get into 2011. What are the trends that surround us right now? What are the opportunities for wisdom to make itself known? What are the vehicles that are there to be utilized? And when you think about our time, if nothing else, we're in a time of, you could call it just a very rapid and very dynamic sort of global integration. Like it or not, that's what's going on. So, globalism as expressed in global business connections, interconnection and interdependence of every world's economy. You have religious and cultural intermingling and cross-fertilization in ways that never could have existed. I mean, Tibet in 1875 was the secluded land that nobody knew anything about. And the Tibetans liked it that way. Now, you go to downtown Chicago, I can take you to a building full of Tibetans. Indians, Chinese, Thai, people from Burma. Every single country of the world, we're mixed together. And it's unavoidable. So there's that goes on. You have the instant access to information through the World Wide Web, where you could be in a little village in Africa, a little town out in Indiana, if you want to be even more remote. I should say Ohio, just to pick a fight with Augie. And you can have access to everything that's going on anywhere that you can tune into. So all of these sorts of things are forming these global connections that we're very much aware of. And we're aware of it normally in painful sorts of ways, it sometimes seems. So, you have an uprising that takes place in Libya. and the next day you go to the pump, and instead of paying the $3.25 you were paying, it's $4.25. You have somebody sneeze in China, and they diagnose it as a SARS virus, and people die in Canada, Singapore, the United States. It's all interconnected. You have an uprising take place in Tunisia. And I'm not going to put you all to the test and put a map up here and ask you to point to Tunisia, because I don't want us to be more embarrassed than we need be. Tunisia in northern Africa. They have an uprising that leads to something that then becomes known as the Arab Spring. Governments fall. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria threatened. And then, if you'd like to believe that this stuff is not connected, now we have the Occupy Wall Street movement, where there is this global interconnection and interdependence that is making itself known forcefully and undeniably, in much the same way that spirits were popping up and the chairs were floating during Blavatsky's day. And it's going on all around us. Now, you would think with this sort of interconnectedness that it would be something that most people would be able to feel very hopeful about. But side by side with this, there is this specter, you could say, of really a growing sense among many of a deepening isolation. Like they're out here alone, not connected in ways that people have been familiar with being connected throughout millennia. You know, the life of the village scarcely exists. Everybody's got to get to work to make money to pay for that water that they're having to buy from the corporations. The family structures, the religious models are all being challenged. And so you have this sort of sense of isolation, sense of alienation that's growing among many. And it reflects itself even in our spiritual life and spiritual practice, to where what the goal becomes for many is self-development. That in some way I can armor myself with these spiritual teachings in such a way that I can be something of an island of serenity, of calm. And so we misuse teachings in many ways. Even now, there are these things that are described as diseases of isolation or diseases of alienation. And such things as the global epidemic of depression. It's not just in the US, around the world. People are feeling cut off, feeling depressed, addictions that abound, violence of all sorts of different sorts, to others and to self. So when we look around, we see this very hopeful sort of connections that are taking place. And side by side with it, we see this other sort of spectral form. So what is the spirituality of this moment? What is the spirituality that moves toward a future that is livable, that is whole, not just for me as an individual, but for this global consciousness that we now find ourselves participating in? So when you look for examples, models, always there are those who, at any time in the human race, there have always been those who have run ahead of the rest. Those who have seen something and responded to something that we're barely sensing, who can model those behaviors. So the model that I see arising is really a model that is not a model of self-development, as needed as that is. But the word that I find that could be the buzzword for this dawning direction of human spirituality would probably fall under the heading of what might be described as compassion. And you hear a lot of people talking that compassion talk. I mean, Mother Teresa talked about compassion and modeled it in her life. Of course, that's the Dalai Lama's continual talk, compassion. Nelson Mandela in the political realm, compassion. And in one sense, we could call compassion something that, by definition, you might say it is the desire to relieve the suffering of others. That's a definition. Theosophical perspective, they talk about compassion as being no mere attribute, but the law of laws. So compassion is something more than just a desire on our part. What happens when we are compassionate is that we connect with something broader, and we affirm a truth. And it's the truth that brought the Theosophical Society into being, the truth of oneness, the truth of expansion beyond the self to those that we view as others, but who are in fact like cells in a greater organ within which we all participate. So in terms of the future, from a theosophical perspective, there is a deep foundation to build upon. And this foundation is not something that was laid by the Theosophical Society or by any individuals. It's something that has been present within us always. But we have required models and we have required examples to call it out. We're at a time now when, of course, with maturity comes responsibility. And the responsibility that I think we find falling to us is the responsibility to wake up, to see. You know, the prayer could be, may I see what I see for a change. And may I finally hear the things that are going on all around me for a change. That sort of clarity certainly will connect us more deeply with one another and will foster this. We're not going to see the utopia in our time. That's not where this particular group, this particular wave, that's not going to happen. We may glimpse it individually, but the important thing that we have to do is move beyond this individualism, move beyond this self-fascination. And probably it's as simple as that. Truth, wisdom, beauty, goodness, all of those things are around us and within us continually. And the only reason we don't see it, in the Bible they say, there are none so blind as those who will not see. Not those who can't see, but those who willfully choose to fascinate themselves with themselves and miss everything that's going on around us. And we have that choice. So I'd suggest that might be a foundation for our future and a good thing to end on in thinking about what the Theosophical Society has done in its 136 years.
Thank you very much, Tim, for a thought-provoking, inspiring, and uplifting suggestion for us to consider. And I'm sure that there are many people who have questions. This evening we are also taking questions from people watching on the web, and they will be asked if you send them in. But please wait for the microphone, and I'll bring it to you so that you can ask your question, and it will be recorded for posterity. So,
and there's no harm in asking nothing.
Were the ideas that you expressed at the end here, expressed early on in the original teachings of HBP and Al-Qaeda? And if so, how are they, expressed at that time? I mean, other than through volumes of books.
Right. So you want the abridged answer, right?
Right.
Well, obviously, I quoted HPB in saying compassion is no attribute. It's the law of laws. So all of those things are there. And it's a funny thing. These spirituality is a very tricky realm in many ways. Because one thing said can have multiple meanings in many ways. In Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about a variety of different teachings. So you have teachings that are for the practitioner, the person who's just sitting down trying to meditate. Then you have teachings that are geared toward a yogi, which is to say someone who has cultivated deep powers within themselves already. And then you have another level of teachings which are for enlightened individuals. So the same thing will speak differently to different people. I think we can understand it like with a child, we can tell them one thing and they'll understand it one way, a teenager another, and someone who's lived some time another. This is the beauty of these Shrek movies, You go there and my daughter's looking, and I said, oh, no. Did she get that? But she didn't. And spirituality, I think, is that way. It was expressed, it's there, and according to our own unfoldment, we get what we need, and then at a later point, we get something else. Does that answer the... Yeah. To some degree, yeah. Sure.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you about compassion. I know that many books have been written about this particular quality or nature of ours, and techniques even to develop this compassion. But can compassion take place without understanding, really? Is my question.
I think it certainly does. You can have often the example of the truly compassionate individual is the mother. That's often the ideal for the example of compassion. And you can have a mother with very limited understanding, but very deep compassion. So in that sense, yes. I think as with many things, the deeper our understanding, the broader our capacity to be compassionate. And so that's always the value for this whole theosophical approach of study, that we try and deepen in our understanding so that we can be more inclusive. Often we use the word deeper or higher as if they're places where you go and you're more of something when you're higher and you're more of something when you're deeper. But probably a better way to phrase it would be more inclusive. So when we are more inclusive of others, we're deeper. We're functioning from a higher place. And so that's the value of study. That's the value of meditation. But ultimately, there is no real spiritual life without service, which expresses itself as compassion.
Are there any other questions? Anybody sending anything in?
Just one person, Kathleen, commented, very good, thank you.
Kathleen, thank you. Come back next time.
We do have another question.
Tim, you talked a little bit about New York City and India. Can you speak real briefly on Wheaton, how we started here?
As I recall the history, the Theosophical Society's national headquarters bounced around for a while. It was I mean, we started off in New York, and then when they moved to India, then there was no section officially in the United States. But then the national headquarters was in California for a while, and then it was in Chicago, and I think it was was it L.W. Rogers' time that it came out here? Yeah, he was a very dynamic businessman and president, and he arranged to purchase the land and then started building it here. We've been here ever since. We're not going anywhere. People clap for the oddest things.
Another question?
Oh,
Sorry. I didn't see. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask, people get so busy with service, and I don't always see it as compassion. I see it as just busy, busy, busy.
Yeah.
But underneath, are they being compassionate and don't know it, or is it just they think they're doing good and that's good enough? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true.
There's so much of that.
Yeah. Yeah, you can just spend all your time spinning your wheels saying you're serving. I had a teacher he would talk about compassion, but then he said everybody doesn't really get it. And so you have people who are deeply engaged in what he described as idiot compassion, which is to say, you know, that's the fellow who says, oh, there's so many hungry people. I'm going to give all of my money. I'm going to quit my job and feed the poor, give all my money to the shelter. And then after a few weeks, they have no money to feed themselves, and they're needing to be fed at the shelter. And so he said, this is, you know, so many people have this wrong conception of service. In Buddhism, there's always the idea of skillful means. So it's one thing to do something, it's another thing to do it skillfully. And so you have to kind of always match these things. It's not good enough just to do in a skillful way, and in a way that is really studied and conscious is what you do.
I think I see a lot of people doing it for self-gratification. People just get puffed up with their own goodness, and you know, and like you said, the real meaning of it and the real value is like the heart. It's not just doing. Is it the reason? Is that where compassion is?
Well, motive is always the most important thing in everything. But, you know, lest we don't want to just totally put down even idiot compassion, because it all does a certain amount of good. But, you know, you'd like to think that you're performing in the highest sort of level that you can. And that's the difference.